A moment. Thank you for coming. Dr. Grossman and I have been around for a couple of days. His father married my cousin, and I was told like this: Dr. Grossman is going to be your new doctor. I had no choice. That was going to be it. And he had to have somebody to experiment on, and I was the ideal guy. So Dr. Grossman is a known cardiologist, has taught at the Upstate Medical School, especially when he started as a cardiologist. Nobody was doing cardiology. It was like a new thing. And he understood it. He wanted to get into that area. He understands everything about the human body, give or take. He's got to the stage where he's able to do what he wants to do, and we are very pleased, and please welcome Dr. Murray Grossman.
And most of you already know what's good and what to do and how to live a long and healthy life. But I'll go over it anyway, and some of you will not. I'm going to say some things you don't like because there are things we do, I think, that are probably not very productive, but that in a moment. I've always been interested in longevity, partly because my father lived to be 97, his brother to be 93. There's longevity in my family, but more important, I was born in 1922. And of those of you who are slow with arithmetic, I'm 92 this month. I was born in 1922. Makes me a survivor. And I remember back in the early 30s thinking about, am I ever going to see the millennium? Am I going to live long enough to see the year 2000? And that was a legitimate thing to ask yourself, because back in the early 30s, the average life expectancy of a male, American male, was about 63, and of a woman about 68. Women were living longer than men. Don't know why. Still don't know why. There's been all kinds of research, but no one can tell us why. The one thing that is for certain is there are more widows than widowers in this world. Maybe it was God's way. I don't know. If you're religion, that's a nice way to think about it. But in any event, I wondered whether I'd make that magic 77. Things have changed, of course. People are living longer, and we're going to talk about lifespan a little bit later. But what I would like to do first is to talk about, I'm going to talk about three things. First, I'm going to talk about what shortens life. Then I'm going to talk about what probably doesn't lengthen or shorten life, and then what does lengthen life. We'll start with what shortens life. By the way, I have no idea how long this talk will run, but my own personal belief is that beyond 50 minutes you save no souls. So we'll finish in 50 minutes no matter what, and if I want to leave time for questions, and I'll leave my watch here to remind me about the time. Maybe we'll run short, I have no idea. When I used to give talks for the medical school, I knew that if I had 28 to 31 slides, that took an hour. Bill Cohen here, who has done a lot of lecturing, and some for me actually, knows that's about the magic number. When anyone would show up with more than 30 slides, I knew I was in trouble time-wise. But the medical school no longer makes my slides. I don't know how to make them. So I have to rely on this thing here. All right, let's talk about what shortens life, because that's very important. And most of you probably already know this, but we'll talk about it. And let's start with obesity. What we eat is what we are. This country has been on a binge, a food binge. Many years ago, I'd say maybe 1978, I used to do work for the Federal Aviation Administration. Wonderful, fun job. I used to have an airplane. I got involved in aviation and the FAA, and I used to go with a panel of cardiologists to Oklahoma City, and we would decide about airmen who had had heart attacks or had various types of heart disease, many of them professional who wanted to get back in the air. We used to have to advise the Federal Air Surgeon on whether it was safe to do. And one particular meeting out there, I happened to sit with a visitor who was a federal air surgeon from New Zealand. And I always ask people from other countries when they're visiting us, I always ask them, tell me what's the most interesting thing about the United States? I asked this fellow, and he said to me, the amount of food you eat. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I've been invited to homes and I've gone to restaurants. We don't have that much food on our plates in New Zealand. You people eat a lot of food. I'd never really been aware of that. From that moment on, I became very sensitive to that. And indeed, we do. We eat a lot compared to other countries. And we've seen an explosion in obesity. It is now estimated that 1/3 of Americans are overweight. Unfortunately, almost 1/3 of our children are overweight. And being overweight has the impact of shortening life. Why does it shorten life? Well, there are two things that happen when you're overweight. Both of them are bad. The first is hypertension. That's what we call it. You call it high blood pressure. High blood pressure is not a very good thing to have. It shortens life. We'll talk about it in a moment. And the second is diabetes. Diabetes mellitus, sugar diabetes. And we've seen an explosion in diabetes in this country. It is estimated that 10% of Americans now are diabetic. Let's first talk about hypertension or high blood pressure.
That's your wife then.
My wife,
What is
you
your-
already missed half the talk.
I know, but I read the sign, I thought,
Okay,
no,
all right, so we're going to talk about high blood pressure. Back when I was a young doctor, we had no treatment for high blood pressure, believe it or not. If any of you took the time, as I did, to watch the Ken Burns story on the Roosevelts, fascinating. I blew 6 nights watching that thing. And Franklin Roosevelt had severe high blood pressure. There was no treatment, none at all. And he died because of this. The problem with hypertension is it does 3 things. One, it makes you, you develop hardening of the arteries to the head, you get strokes, you get heart attacks, you get kidney failure, all bad things, all things that shorten life. The first medicines that became available for hypertension occurred, I think that was about the early 1960s. And since that time, there's been an explosion in medication for hypertension. We have all kinds of things that attack the blood pressure system in multiple ways, so we have effective treatments. But it does shorten life. The second is obese people get diabetes. And diabetes shortens life too. Diabetes affects the blood vessels to the head. It affects it to the heart, to the kidneys, and to the legs. And people with diabetes get heart attacks, they get kidney failure. They too have a shortened life. We have all kinds of medications now to treat diabetes. They affect the blood sugar in multiple ways, but they all effectively lower blood sugar. The problem is that patient compliance isn't always good. Resistance to the medicine sometimes occurs. And the end result is that people who are obese and have these complications have shortened lives. Now, what is obese? Well, we in medicine use a thing called, we have a fancy formula we use, which I won't even burden you with. I have my own formula for obesity, and I've used it all my life as a doctor. And for women, I use the following formula. Let's take a 5'5", I'm doing this because all of you are going to want to know whether you're obese or not. Okay, I take a 5'5" woman. I allow 100 pounds for the first 5 feet. For the next inch, she gets 10 pounds. That's 110. And for the next 4 inches, 5 pounds. So let's add that up. 110 and 20 more, 130. So our 5'5" woman, her normal weight would be 130 pounds. And then, because this is the United States, I throw in a fudge factor. That's a joke, fudge. Wait. Just for those of you who are beginning to doze. Anyway, so I throw in a fudge factor of 10%. So my woman who walks into my office, who weighs more than 10% of 130, is 13 pounds. 143 would be, for me, the upper limit of normal. For men, a little different. I start with 100 pounds for his 5 feet. Let's take a 5'10" man. I start with 100 pounds for the first 5 feet. I give 10 pounds for the next 3 inches. That's 130. And for the next 7 inches, 5 pounds. That's 35 more pounds. So our 5'10" man would be 130 and 35, 165. And then my fudge factor, 10%. 10% of 165 would be 181, 182. That's my upper limit of normal for a man 5'10". If you're over those numbers, you're heavy. You're above normal. Now here's the good news. The good news is that if you're overweight, and not significant, moderately overweight, and you don't have hypertension, you don't have diabetes, it probably doesn't shorten your lifespan. Probably doesn't. Everyone's probably saying, oh yeah, I know Joe Jones or Amy or whoever who weighs is a little heavy, but they're fine and they're 85 years old. Well, the fact is it's probably benign, as long as you don't have the complications that go with that disease, that obesity. Okay, we're talking obesity now. We're going to talk about blood fats. The fats are in the fire. In 1960s, a man by the name of Ansel Keys got interested in this whole business of hardening of the arteries. We call it atherosclerosis or arteriosclerosis. And he knew that the first substance that was deposited in the artery was a fatty substance called cholesterol. And the cholesterol sets up an inflammatory reaction, and then over time the body calcifies it. And as this process evolves, it narrows the artery opening so that less blood can get through the artery. And it produces in the coronary arteries a syndrome called angina, pain, Greek word for pain. My old professor of medicine used to say, if you see a man walking on Salina Street in Syracuse in January and he stops in front of Flaws or Addis's, 2 women's stores in those days, he's not stopping because he's interested in women's clothing. He's got chest pain. He's got angina, not enough blood coming through. If the surface of that vessel, which has bulged out into the artery, ruptures, a blood clot forms, that's a heart attack. The blood is totally cut off. Well, Ansel Keys finally decided that there were 2 forms of this blood fat in our bloodstream. One that he called high density, I'm going to call it thick cholesterol. And the other he called low density or thin cholesterol. And he found in his studies that if the thick cholesterol was low in your blood and the thin cholesterol was high, you were at great risk of having a heart attack. Great risk. And fortunately, over the years, a bunch of products have come on the market which alter the blood fats. They raise the thick blood fat and they lower the thin one and put you in a low risk group instead of a high risk group for having a heart attack. Most of these drugs are variations of a drug they're called statins. And there are about 5 or 6 or 8 or 9, God knows how many Me Too statins on the market. They all do basically the same thing, some a little bit more effective than others, some of them with maybe a little more complication, greater risk, but they all accomplish the same thing. They lower mortality rate by raising the good cholesterol and lowering the bad one. And those products are on the market. But if you have abnormalities in your blood fats, you're clearly at risk for having heart attacks. Physical activity. I got interested in physical activity early on. I had gone to 1956, I went to Boston to the American College of Physicians meeting. And there was a man by the name of Paul Dudley White. I went to a moot court thing that my family supports for the law school, and I brought my phone with me. And I don't ever carry a phone. I don't know how to turn the thing on. I have less trouble turning it off, more trouble turning it off. In the middle of this moot court thing, my wife called me. And here we are in this federal court down in the, and my phone is ringing, and I'm trying to turn the damn thing off. And finally, Fed Scullin, who's the federal judge, said, we'll all wait while Dr. Grossman figures out how to work his telephone. I didn't know. Anyway, where was I? Oh, physical activity. So I went to this meeting, and Paul Dudley White, who was, and Lou talked about this a moment ago, interesting enough, he was one of the first cardiologists. He, along with Sam Levine, worked at Harvard Medical School. They were cardiologists, and Paul White was dragged out. He was now in his 80s, and he was dragged out to talk about what he had seen in cardiology over the years in Boston. He said when he was a young doctor, turn of the century, he said it was rare to see anybody with coronary heart disease. He said by the time he retired in 1953 or 4, he said it was an epidemic in Boston. And he said he was convinced that it related to activity. He said when I was a young man, we all walked, we rode our bikes. He said there were no cars, most of us didn't have cars. And at night, there was nothing to sit down in front of other than radio, and we didn't sit there very long. He said now everybody rides cars, everybody sits down at night and watches television for 2 or 3 hours. He said it's the lack of activity. That was the first time I'd heard that. And I thought it was fascinating. Fascinating. And then a couple of years later, another study by Alexander Leaf, who was a doctor at Harvard also. He was interested in articles that he had read about groups that were living to be 90, 100, not in this country. He went to 2 areas where extreme longevity had been reported. One was in the Caucasus, the other was in the Andes, and studied these people. And his conclusion was that they all lived at altitude. They didn't have fancy ways to get around. They had to walk, they had to climb, and there was the physical activity that was a common denominator. Interesting, another study. This one was unfortunately criticized because where he went, there were no good records, birth records, so no one really knew whether they were 90 or 100. In truth, they just claimed they were. Don't know, but I think he was onto something. And then, very recently, if any of you are fans of that source of medicine called 60 Minutes, back in the spring and again early in the fall, they repeated the study. Very interesting study being done at the University of California Medical School at La Jolla on a group of senior citizens who live in a setup similar to the Nottingham here, living, all of them in their 70s, 80s, 90s, even 1 or 2 that were in their early 100s. And they were doing a study on what allowed these people to live to such a ripe old age. And their conclusion, interestingly enough, was activity. These people were all vigorous, they were active. Someone asked me just a few minutes ago, if you were to describe yourself, what, in one word, how would you describe yourself? I said active, active. I heard, I have to stop for a moment. Years ago, I was driving my car around and I heard a radio broadcast. And the interviewer was interviewing a very popular comedian actor named Eddie Cantor. This was in the 50s or 60s. Actor on Broadway, movies, everything. And the interviewer said, Mr. Cantor, when you sing, you always clap your hands and you bounce around the stage, you dance around the stage. Why do you do that? He said, well, when I grew up as a young entertainer, I used to work in the Borscht Belt. That's in the Catskills, the Jewish section of the Catskills. And he said, I found if I stood still while I sang, it was too easy a target for Rotten Tomatoes. Well, that applies to life. If you stand still too long, you're an easy target for the Rotten Tomatoes. So, physical activity, probably very important. Not probably, absolutely very important. I noticed when I was a young man, I'd walk into the hospital. You probably, because you're like I am, you can't stand still. I was always walking faster than everybody else. Always, always
and
faster.
not using the elevator.
Huh?
And not using the elevators.
And not using elevators. We used to have a fellow who taught us electrocardiography. I worked with him for many years. Walter Street. He, the old university hospital, he would never use the elevator. He walked all 4 floors because the EKG lab was up on the 4th floor. Always walked the 4 floors. He was an early example of physical activity. And finally, I said, I put this down, I want to talk about lifestyle in this country these days, because there are a lot of things people are doing that are negative that shorten life. Let's start with the most important, cigarettes. Cigarettes, when I was a kid in high school playing sports, I was told, can't smoke because it shortens your breath. It doesn't give you good breath. And what did I know about it? I just thought, well, fine, I won't smoke. And I didn't. But by the 1950s, we knew that cigarettes did bad things to the lungs. Not only do cigarettes cause cancer of the lung, they cause cancer in other places. They cause cancer of the throat and of the vocal cords. Cancer of the vocal cords almost exclusively occurs in people who smoke heavily and who drink heavily. So bad, bad, bad cigarettes are. Alcohol. Alcohol is the friend of most of us in this room. It's wonderful to have a drink before dinner, relaxes you, increases your appetite, and probably healthy. But for some people, alcohol is anything but healthy. And alcohol in excess damages the lung, produces scarring throughout the liver. I didn't mean lung. Damages the liver, produces scarring in the liver called cirrhosis, the medical term, and ultimately death from complications from the scarring in the liver. It also produces heart disease, damages heart muscle. It's one of the two forms of reversible heart disease, where if you stop smoking, the heart recovers. It produces a nasty, nasty damage to the brain, a psychosis called Korsakoff syndrome, and that's not reducible. Once it happens, you can stop smoking, it never gets better. You're permanently damaged. So alcohol, not so very good. Drugs, fascinating. I used to think when I was a young doctor that drugs were a class phenomenon. Certain people, poor people, use drugs, and that middle class people, upper class people didn't use drugs. Wrong. Everybody uses drugs. Everybody does. Anyone who works in an ER as a physician will tell you that they're seeing ODs all the time. Heroin, cocaine, extraordinarily common, and you never know who's on them. People you know and know well may well be using these drugs. The real difference with the drug situation, though, in the last 20, 30 years is the abuse of prescription drugs, pills. Someone in the front row is going, and it's true. We are a pill-popping nation. We love pills, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with taking pills. Many times we have to take the pills to stay healthy. But the abuse of drugs, pain-relieving drugs like the OxyContins, have become a major problem in this country. We see more overdoses from OxyContin in our emergency rooms than we do cocaine and heroin. Big, big problem. And finally, violence. We're a violent country. We love guns. I'm not opposed to guns. I think if I lived in a different society, instead of in an urban one, a suburban one, I would probably love to go hunting with guns and target shoot and all that sort of thing. But I don't think I'm happy with the number of guns that are available in this country today. We were in a restaurant last year, my wife and I, small town, and maybe, I forget where, maybe in Wyoming, I don't know. Anyway, some guy came in with his family and he was packing a gun on his hip. I'd never seen that before. And I'll tell you, it made me feel a little uncomfortable. I didn't know what the mental state of this guy was. All I knew was there was a gun in the room and it was easily reachable. Guns. 35,000 people die in this country from guns. Homicides, suicides, accidental death. 2,000 or 3,000 children die every year from guns. So guns are a very destructive thing to have. Our death rate from guns is 10 times what it is in England or Canada, where they have strict gun control laws per 100,000 people. 10 times. And yet the National Rifle Association is able to control our Congress, and we still have guns everywhere, and I don't think we'll ever get rid of them. Other habits that people have picked up in this country that are destructive. I heard a story not so long ago of a woman who was so obsessed with having a sunburn all the time, being tanned, that she would go to these tanning salons. She died of melanoma, cancer of the skin. People text all day. Young people walk around all the time, this is a new posture. Everybody's doing this. It was a wonderful front page of the New Yorker magazine, showing a family of four sitting, this was last summer, sitting on the beach. Father, mother, two children, all four of them sitting there with their phones in front of them, doing their thing. Texting, fine if you're sitting on a beach, not so good if you're driving a car. We're seeing a lot of deaths from alcohol and from texting, from people driving cars. This current generation has developed some habits that are pretty destructive. And finally, jeans. Not the ones you wear. The ones you inherit. And there are genes that are bad for you, and you have no control over that. The earliest genes that were discovered that were bad for you were the breast cancer genes, the BCR, breast cancer 1 and 2. And you can't, if you have it, you have it. You can't avoid it. And it shortens life. There are other genes that have already been discovered which clearly predispose to cancer. There are good genes, but we'll talk about that later. So genes, something you can't do anything about, can shorten your life. I wish I could be more positive about some of these things, but you can't change. Someone said to me a while ago, you can't change human habit. You can't get people who are heavy to exercise or eat less. It's almost impossible. You look at the number of diets on the market that you can subscribe to, the number of exercise places you can go to. Clearly, people are trying to take advantage of what's going on, but most people find it very difficult to change their life habits. Okay, with that as a preamble, what's bad, let's talk about what's not good and not bad. And I'm probably going to upset some people, including my wife. As I said, we're a pill-popping nation. We love pills. Nothing wrong with it. We have an obsession with things like vitamins and minerals and antioxidants. Why do we take them? We take them because we think they prolong life. No one knows. The Federal Drug Administration requires any drug company with a new product to prove that it works. They can't put it on the market unless they've proven A, that it's safe, unless they've demonstrated what the proper dose is, and whether it works. That is not true with the vitamin, mineral, antioxidant business. They don't have to prove anything. They can say anything they want. Doesn't matter. The federal government will do nothing about it. And I hear all these extravagant claims. No one has really studied whether these things prolong life or whether they shorten life. No one's done a study of it. So we don't know. But they're costly. They do produce one disease. It's called anemia of the pocketbook. Because they cost money. But I don't think they do much. I do tell people, if you feel more comfortable taking them, if you think it's helping you, for God's sakes, do it. Do it. I never miss taking vitamins, my vitamins. I haven't taken them in 70 years and I don't miss it. Not a bit. But there are people, friends of mine, who take their vitamins every day and are convinced they help them. Do it. If you think they help, then for God's sakes, do it. But they probably don't. They probably don't. All right, I probably offended at least a third of the audience. And that's good, because it'll produce some questions. Let's now go to the heart of the matter. Again, a joke, the heart of the matter. Let's talk about what's good. what's good in life. What are we doing that's prolonging life? Because we are prolonging life. In 1900, 0.3% of the population were over 80. When I first opened my office in 1951, before I went full-time with the medical school, I had one patient over 80. One patient, a woman, of course, not a man. And I have to tell a funny story about this woman. She used to come in the office every time I would see her with a book basket full of books. And one particular day she came in and she walked in the office to see me, and she said to me, "Dr. Grossman, I'm in no hurry and I feel pretty good. There's a young man out there who's jiggling his legs up and down. He must be awfully sick. Why don't you see him first?" Who was that man?
Tell me.
Absolutely true story. I said, no, he's really not terribly sick. I'll see you first. Anyway, by the year 2000, 3.5% of the population were over 80. Over 80. There's some 8,000 to 10,000 people over 100 in this country. So we're clearly lengthening the lifespan. No question about it. All right, so we're talking about what is good. Well, the first thing that's good is cigarettes. We've dropped the number of people smoking down to about 20%. That's the good news. What's the bad news?
20%.
Of that 20%, most of them are young people. Older people got the message. Don't smoke. I suspect in this room, no one is now currently smoking. Does anyone? No, I won't even ask. I don't want to embarrass. Okay, so we've stopped smoking. The drinking situation hasn't changed a hell of a lot. People are still drinking, and it unfortunately plays a major role in accidents and shortening life. But medicine has made it, I'm not going to sound like I'm plugging my system, but medicine has made a huge difference in the lifespan. Beginning early on with immunizations, of course, but more importantly, new medicines for diseases that used to kill. I talked earlier about blood pressure pills, medication. I talked earlier about heart disease, about medicine for blood fats. But we've done wonderful things with cancer. We now cure certain types of cancers, and for those that we can't cure, we frequently can prolong life. That's a real positive thing. Heart disease, that's dear to my heart, because when I first started out in 1951, if you had a heart attack and arrived in the hospital alive, you had a 30% chance of dying in the hospital, 70% chance of surviving. Of the 70% that survived, 70% of them were dead at 10 years. 49 people dead. We had a handful alive at 10 years. Today, with the use of modern treatments in cardiology, beginning with the coronary care units, which came in 69, 68, somewhere maybe 67, no, earlier, 65. We put the first one in at Krause. We put our first coronary care unit at the Krause. We saw our mortality rate go from 30% to 15% in 1 year. It was astounding. Today, with the use of stents, with the use of medications, the mortality rate for a heart attack, if you arrive in the hospital alive, about 8%. And the mortality rate thereafter, for the next 10 years, about 1% per year. So instead of 70% dead at 10 years, you've got what, 8 and 10, 18%, 82% still alive. Huge impact, huge impact. And you can do that with so many of the diseases that I had to deal with as a young doctor. So medicine has made a huge difference. Early detection, diseases like diabetes or high blood pressure or cancer. We can modify the life course of that disease, prolong life with early detection. So medicine's done a lot of good. They have maybe have created some bad, but most of it's good. Okay, let's talk about genes again. genes, those wonderful things we wear, and wonderful things we inherit. There are genes that clearly prolong life. I don't know how many of you, one person came up to me today before I started talking and said, I had a relative that lived to 107 and another 101. Longevity runs in families. Clearly, there are genes that give us long life. We haven't identified most of those genes yet. It's very early in the course of genetic study. We don't know, but clearly we are what we inherit. I suspect not only does it give us long life, but it creates in us things that well, we're not an addictive personality, we're people that like to exercise. It does things to us that help us live to a ripe old age. But genes are vital. And over time, I'm sure that we will find genes that prolong life. So genes are vital. And now, exercise, my favorite topic. I became convinced early on from some of the studies I reported and from my own experience in cardiology that exercise was very important. There was a guy by the name of Herman Hellerstein from Cleveland back in the 60s. When I first started, if you had a heart attack, you spent 4 weeks on your back in bed. Then we would write an order saying the patient may dangle. What does that mean? It means that the patient could sit up and dangle their legs over the side of the bed. And then we'd get them out of bed and they could sit in the chair. It was 6 weeks before we'd let them walk. Now what happens? They're out of bed the next day, they've had the stent put in, they're home 2 days later, and they're active from that point on. Everything's changed. But Hellerstein said, if we exercise our cardiac patients, they'll live longer. And he had some impressive numbers to show that that was true. And so we began to put our cardiac heart attack patients in exercise programs. And indeed, they did live longer. Exercise, very, very important. What's exercise? That's a question people ask me all the time. Early on, used to say, exercise is something that you should do to push your heart rate up to 85% of the maximum heart rate to get effective exercise. That's probably not true. The number we used to use is you subtract your age from 220, and let's say I'm 90 years old. Let's make 80 easier number. 80 from 220, that's 140. 10% of that would be 126. Another 119. So an 80-year-old, you want to get to 119. Not necessary. Any kind of exercise is positive. Any kind of exercise is good. What's exercise for a 30-year-old is obviously not exercise for a 70-year-old. It has to be appropriate for the age. It has to be appropriate for the condition of the person you're prescribing exercise for. But it is got the two things it has to be. It has to be fun, and it has to be comfortable. You've got to be comfortable doing it, and it's got to be fun to do it. Otherwise, you're not going to do it. It takes a lot of discipline, I will tell you. In a January day, because I used to do this, to go out and run when I was 40 years old, and the temperature was 5 below zero, even my dog wouldn't run with me. I'm out there running 4 miles. I don't run anymore. I stopped when I was 85. I didn't stop running, but I still go to the gym. What's adequate exercise? Well, I think probably the minimum you have to do is at least 3 to 4 hours a week. And it can be as simple as a walk, riding a bicycle, going to a yoga class. It can be anything that gets you moving. I walk my dog 3 times a day, never at night. My wife does that. But walking the dog, as long as you're spending that time moving, it's critical. And it's hard to get people to do that because we get out of the habit of exercising as we get older. We like to sit down, we like to read the newspaper, we like to watch the television. It's destructive. It's important that you get out at least 3 to 4 days a week, at least 45 minutes to an hour of time. That's not their 168 hours, 172 hours in a week. I used to know that number, it's close. Anyway, 4 hours out of 168, that's almost nothing. It's almost nothing. And yet it's so hard to get people to get into a regular exercise program. Very, very difficult. Bill and I are obsessive, we exercise all the time. Go to the gym all the time. Right?
I don't punch my age into the machines anymore because they want to stop my heart rate at 110, so I have to just.
Yeah, some of these machines
I punch
are-
in 40 instead or 50 instead of my regular.
Some of these machines are set so that they will let you know when you approach your maximum heart rate. The number I just gave you, 220 minus your age, 85% of that. The machines are geared to do that for you. I lie.
And so do I.
Absolutely. So instead of saying I'm 92, I say I'm 78. That lets me get further.
I do 50.
Well, anyway, so very important exercise. I can't stress that enough. Drugs are an absolute no-no. I don't care about the vitamins. I don't care about the minerals. They don't hurt you. The antioxidants don't hurt you. Probably don't help you, but they don't hurt you. And if you're comfortable taking them, do it. But pain pills, narcotics, they're bad. Stay away from them. Okay, I'm coming up on 50 minutes. It worked, even without the slides. Great. My fear is always running short, never long. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is the life curve. In medicine, oh, by the way, I left out one other thing. You really should see your doctor if you can get an appointment. It's not always easy, not always easy. But if you can get an appointment, you ought to see him at least once a year, especially as you get older. Because there are things that can happen that if they're picked up early enough can be modified or cured. So you should see your doctor once a year. And if you have a health problem, you should see your doctor an appropriate number of times to keep that health problem under control. Doctors are still important. Thank God. Now, I want to talk about the curve of life. And this is going to be hard to see, I'm sorry to say, but I don't have anything of them. Very darker than this. But if you put, you have something better?
Yep, I gotta run.
Over here, I'm going to put the percentage of people alive. Woof, this is awful.
She'll be right back.
Okay. Ah! Percentage of people alive. And this is the age. Oh, this is really good. 0, age 100. What we would like to do in medicine is to rectangularize the curve of life. We'd love people to start up here at 100%. I'll put 5% down here. We would like to have a life curve that does this, and somewhere around 85 or 90 begins to tail off, and eventually we're all dead by 100 or whatever. Looks like a rectangle. I found one that really works good. Thank you, Judy.
Well, I got some exercise.
We would like to rectangularize the curve of life. In the year 1900, it looked pretty much like, this is age 50, it looked pretty much like this. And with each succeeding generation, it began to look more like this. So we've been moving this curve in this direction until it looks more and more like a rectangle. The ideal goal, if we were meant to live to be 100, is to get us out here and then boom, we all die. No one lives forever, like I said. We aren't there yet. And here's the sad, sad part. This current generation of young people, because of the explosion of obesity, because of the increased incidence of hypertension and diabetes, because of their lifestyles with the guns and the drugs and everything else, it's going to be the first generation that moves this curve in the wrong direction. No question about it. It's going to be the first one that shortens life, moves the curve away from where we want it to be. Okay, 50 minutes, 51 minutes. Questions? Antioxidants.
No.
Oh,
I have a great belief in them for definite reasons, but we won't get into that. I'd like to start off with quoting Woody Allen. You can live to be 100 if you give up all of the things that make it worthwhile to live to be 100. But my question is this.
Oh, I love that. I love that.
You like Chris Rock even better. Anything after 72 is natural death, because even if you get hit by a truck, you weren't able to jump out of the way fast enough. Okay, but my question is this. In the 50s, my very first career was as an ORT at St. Joseph's Hospital in the operating room. And when the cardio lab opened, I became Dr. Gensini's assistant in ORT and his heart catheterizations and so forth. And
Very
research.
famous man.
Along with Dr. Delmonico and Heitzman, their very first chest operations and open heart surgery, I was their ORT, taking part in those. When we packed people on ice to
Question.
The question is this.
You forgot it.
One thing that wasn't
It
stressed.
happens.
Yeah, I'm a senior. I have senior moments.
Yeah.
Okay. One thing is this. How do you feel about the fact that, well, my own parents died in their mid-50s of vascular diseases. I'm 80. I don't have any ailments at all, okay? And I think a big part of this is for the past 50 years, been eating whole grain foods, fresh fruits and vegetables, nuts, fish, and keeping away from processed foods that contain so much salt, sugar, and fat.
That's a very.
What about diet? Because
Okay,
I think
I
the diet.
think that's important.
Exactly.
I think that, and a lot of people ask me about this. We do adulterate our food. Our cattle, the meat industry uses antibiotics to lengthen, to increase the lifespan of the animal, to fatten them up. They use all sorts of negative things that we shouldn't be eating. But in spite of all those things, we're living longer. The curve is going that way. I personally eat everything that doesn't bite back. So, you attribute your 80 years to eating sensibly. I attribute my 92 years to eat anything I want. Yes.
Murray, we're living longer, but are we living longer healthfully? How about all
Well,
these
that's a
people
good
who are
point.
living longer, but they're ill, and they're in the mental
boy, that's a whole new
institutions, and they're
subject.
in...
End of life stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the fact that we've seen an explosion as people have gotten older, we've seen an explosion in dementia. By the way, the California study suggests that exercise reduces the incidence of dementia.
Reduces the incidence of what?
Dementia.
It's
Dementia.
very good for your brain.
Doesn't help hearing. Anyway. It's true. We're seeing so much more dementia. And a lot of the lifestyle of the elderly is severely impaired. It's hardly what we would call quality life. I don't know any way around that. We're living a long time and we haven't solved the problem of dementia.
The second part of that is, have you read Ezekiel Emanuel's latest on I Hope to Die at 75?
I've heard about it, I haven't read it. Yeah.
That would be a good
I'll get you in a
discussion.
second back there.
A lot of us are getting to the point where our doctors are retiring. It's very hard to find a doctor when you're this age who wants to take on a new patient, and finding geriatricians in this area is also very difficult. Any suggestions?
That's a whole other lecture. I actually I've written a paper, trying to get it published at the moment, looking at the problems we have with finding doctors. We've become a nation of specialists. In 1950, there were no specialists. There were doctors who took care of people, family practitioners and internists, and there were surgeons. Now we have a small number of primary care doctors. We have specialists. 75% of the doctors in this country are specialists. Not only do we have specialists, we have subspecialists. We have orthopedists who only work from here to here, or from just here.
And it has to be on the left side.
I love that. It's become extraordinarily difficult. And I don't know I know the answer. And in this paper, I've already discussed the answer. But it's going to be impossible to do for a long, long time. Somewhere, somehow, someone has got to say that what's good for medicine is not necessarily good for the people in this country. And we've got to reverse. If you go to Canada, you go to England, you go to any Scandinavian country, the largest number of doctors are doctors who give you primary care, who you can get to see. They don't have 75% specialists. And their healthcare numbers are better than ours. We're now 15th and 12th in longevity, I think.
Is that a reason for practicing on the weekends, finances?
Well, there are all kinds of reasons why we have specialists. All kinds of reasons. There's a question in the back.
In the area of technology, as the aging process moves forward, is there anything out there on the horizon that's going to, be a real good side breakthrough or something like that would help all this?
I wish I could say yes. I'm not so sure. Medicine is in love with technology. You see these advertisements in the papers. We have the Da Vinci machine. Yeah. Non-invasive, shorter stage, less complications. There was an article in the New England Journal of Medicine within the last week pointing out the fact that the cost is excessive. The complications are just as many as when you do traditional surgery. Really, to pay $250,000 for a machine that doesn't add much is what happens in medicine in this country. We have more MRI machines in this country than all of the rest of the world combined. Make a lot of money.
This is about exercise. I've often wondered if I go into a room and I wash some windows and vacuum some floors, and the whole thing takes me, it's not sustained activity, but the whole thing takes me 2 hours. Is that exercise?
You have probably hit on the thing that I talked about earlier, why women live longer than men. Men go to the office and they sit on their cans and talk on the phone and talk to people. And women work all day long. They're cleaning. They're walking the dog. They're busy. They're more active. I think if I had to make a guess, that's the reason why you people outlive us. Women outlive men. Because that's exercise.
So you can count that as,
Oh,
as
sure.
one of your exercise. I work for 2
Absolutely.
hours.
I'm sure that's why we remember. Oh my goodness gracious, yes.
What's your feeling about aspirin?
About aspirin? Aspirin, small amounts. Aspirin works in a funny way. It attaches to platelets and prevents them from clotting, prevents clotting. And in small doses, baby doses of aspirin, because it's an enzymatic thing. You don't need the 5-grain aspirin. The 1-grain children's aspirin will accomplish that. There are lots of papers that suggest that it reduces the incidence of heart attacks. And there are even papers that suggest it reduces the incidence of cancer of the colon. Most common cancer, one of the most common cancers in this country. If patients said to me, should I be on aspirin? If they ask, I say yes, if there's no contraindication, such as a history of a bleeding ulcer or something, or bleeding tendencies. Probably a good thing to do. Have I done it? No. But I think it's good. I don't always do things that are good for me. Yes?
There's a huge emphasis on vitamin D3.
Oh, I'm glad you, oh God, thank you. May I quickly speak to that, because I forgot. There is a vitamin that's important, and that's vitamin D. We live in northern climates. We don't get a lot of sun. Sun reacts to the skin of the body, helps to create vitamin D. Vitamin D is important for bone growth and strength. I think it is reasonable, if you have a history of osteoporosis, or if you're a woman, older woman, it's probably reasonable to be on vitamin D and extra calcium. I absolutely agree with that. However, a lot of people are on vitamin D that probably don't have to be on it, whose bones are normal, whose bone scans are normal, and whose bone densities are normal, and who have normal serum levels of vitamin D. I think it's abused a little bit, but absolutely, especially women who tend to get osteoporosis more than men. Vitamin D and calcium are important. Although, there have been some recent papers that show there seems to be a greater incidence of fractures of the hip in people who are on these products, but I do think it's important, yes.
What do you think about the legalization of marijuana in Colorado and
Oh,
Washington?
boy. I think that marijuana probably causes less problems than alcohol.
Yes.
So I would be in favor. I also recognize that a certain number of people are going to abuse it, that wouldn't abuse it if it weren't readily available. So there is gain, but there's also some loss. I feel the same way about gambling. I think this governor with all these damn casinos is creating a huge problem in this state. That's not about health. That's about the health of your pocketbook. Yes.
This is almost a personal question, but I've recently lost my wife. I've been married, was married for 57 years, and I'm trying to do the right thing for myself because I know I'm in extreme danger with an life event at that time. And what would you advise? What would you advise me to do?
It's difficult, you know.
Would you repeat the question?
It's basically, I think he's lost his wife recently. He's alone. And there are risks as you get older of living alone, frankly. Falls, eating regularly when you're the only person, especially for men. Women seem to take better care of themselves than men. And those are problems. And I don't have any easy solution. I wish I did. I can make
Not severe as that. I do have. I moved it and lived with my family there, etc. But my wife, for 57 years, I had a companion all the time. My wife had multiple sclerosis for 40 years of it, so we were very close because I was also a caregiver. And suddenly it all stops.
You're bringing up a couple of subjects. One of them is there is a natural reaction, a normal reaction to the loss of a spouse, and that is depression.
Murray,
And that needs to, yes.
sometimes you could take advantage of a senior center that's here.
I'm doing that.
Okay, that's a good mental way to do it and a good physical way to get yourself motivated, involved, and probably lengthen your days, the quality of your days. So Marlena said, get up here and say something about the senior center. Did I do okay, Marlena?
The hour is well up, and my wife has to go to her garden club, and there are at least 3 or 4 members of her garden club here. So I'm going to stay for a little while. Glad to answer any personal questions. Thank you. You're a wonderful audience. You laughed in all the right places. Thank you.